Ethan Morgan could still recall the pungent mix of motor oil and sweat from his teenage years more vividly than anything else. That stubborn scent clung to his memories like a shadow, trailing behind him from the dim, cramped garage where he put in after-school hours, all the way to the neat suburban home he'd one day purchase for his own family. Before he ever ran a successful auto repair business, before he got married or became a father, or faced the quiet, torturous truths that would come to define him, Ethan was just a scrawny kid in a grease-streaked t-shirt, arms smeared with oil, hoping to find some kind of purpose in the echo of clanking tools and clattering metal. His childhood unfolded in the grittier side of Silverton, a mid-sized American town wedged between a crumbling industrial zone and well-kept upper-class neighborhoods. Growing up among rusted-out factories and homes with chip paint, Ethan quickly understood that survival came through sheer willpower and elbow grease. He never griped about mopping the shop floor or fetching coffee for the regulars. If anything, he found a strange sense of pride in the labor, daydreaming that one day he might own a garage of his own. His father had been a ghost, vanishing before Ethan could string together proper sentences. The topic was off-limits at home, especially with his mother, who pulled long shifts at a local diner just to make ends meet. That heavy silence surrounding his father's absence only deepened Ethan's resolve to someday be a better man, a better father. He made a promise to himself early on. If he ever had a family, he'd show up for them, loyal, loving, and unshakable. But as life would eventually prove, fate had its own cruel sense of irony. Ethan was in his junior year of high school when he crossed paths with Lena Whitaker, a girl whose warm presence and soft features gave the illusion of kindness and sincerity. She wasn't the flashy type nor painfully shy, she hovered somewhere in between, exuding an approachable charm. There was an honesty in her light brown eyes that caught his attention, especially the day she walked up and introduced herself with a soft, "Hey, I'm Lena. Don't you work at Dugan's garage?" He just wrapped up a sweaty marching band practice, packing away his trumpet by the bleachers. Turns out she recognized him from her dad's regular trips to the shop. When she started talking, Ethan nearly dropped his trumpet case, stunned that someone like her was actually speaking to him. Yeah, he stammered. Your dad's the one with the old GMC, right? She laughed and rolled her eyes. You should see him try to fix it himself. Honestly, it's a miracle the engine hasn't exploded yet. They ended up chatting about school projects and random town trivia, like who had the best fries or milkshakes. Lena teased him about the grime under his fingernails, and he shrugged, calling it his permanent tattoo. As the sun dipped behind the bleachers, he finally worked up the nerve to ask for her number. The way she smiled, just a little shy, as she scribbled it on a scrap of paper made him feel lighter than air for the rest of the week. Their relationship blossomed quickly: Friday night football games, shared study sessions in the library, and even occasional weekends at the garage, where Lena took a short bookkeeping gig. Ethan came to admire what he believed was her fierce loyalty and her attention to the small things, remembering birthdays, baking brownies just because, and offering what seemed like genuine affection. In return, he made her laugh with his awkward charm and the kind of wide-eyed optimism only a teenage dreamer could carry. By graduation, Ethan already knew college wasn't in the cards. There was no money for it, and besides, he trusted his future would be built with his hands, not textbooks. He enrolled in an automotive program at the local community college, attending classes at night while continuing full-time at Dugan's. Lena took odd jobs, studied part-time, and eventually landed a receptionist position at a dentist's office. Their relationship stayed solid, at least on the surface, two kids slowly building something real, one careful step at a time. By his early 20s, Ethan proposed. He had worked his way up to lead mechanic at Dugan's and had been saving every spare dollar to eventually buy out the old man's share when retirement came. And when that moment arrived, he leapt. Overnight, the once rundown shop was reborn as Morgan Auto Repair, his first real achievement. They tied the knot behind a friend's barn. Lena wore a simple white dress that looked more like it belonged in a thrift store window than a wedding aisle, and Ethan wore a suit that didn't quite fit. Their families, small, distant, gathered close, joined by a handful of high school friends, including some of Ethan's old bandmates. It was modest, but heartfelt. A rare day of real joy. As the months rolled on, business picked up. Thanks to Ethan's reputation for honesty and his relentless hours, Morgan Auto Repair started turning a decent profit. Growth came gradually, an extra lift here, a new set of tools there, but it came nonetheless. He hired help, lengthened his hours, and chased new goals with the same tenacity that had always driven him. For the first time in his life, money wasn't a constant worry. Eventually, he and Lena bought a modest home in the suburbs. It was a strange, satisfying feeling walking into a house that was entirely theirs. But with success came pressure. Long hours became longer. 10, 12, sometimes 14-hour shifts. He'd come home stiff and exhausted, with tension knotting his shoulders and barely enough energy to speak. Lena, who had quit her job to manage the house and the endless emotional weight of keeping their lives in order, started to feel neglected. She noticed him pulling away, even if he didn't. Dinner often went cold waiting on the table, untouched as he staggered through the door well past dark. In the beginning, she was understanding, telling herself this was all part of the sacrifice. But deep down, something hardened in her. She missed the boy who once brought her milkshakes just to make her smile. Now, she resented the man who barely noticed her anymore. What had once been a relationship grounded in love and laughter had quietly dissolved into routines and emotional distance, brief kisses that felt obligatory, and weekends filled with solo errands that never overlapped. They didn't fight. In fact, the silence between them was more unsettling than any argument could have been. They lived in the same house but occupied different emotional planets. Ethan told himself it was just a season, one of those difficult stretches couples go through. Once the business found its rhythm, he promised himself he'd come back to her in full. Lena, however, was unraveling in her own way. She stifled her resentment, swallowing it down like bitter medicine. She told herself she needed to be more patient, more helpful, less demanding. But behind her courteous smiles and the pretense of contentment, there was an emptiness that grew heavier with each passing day. Ethan didn't see it. Or maybe, she thought, he chose not to. Then came the call. Ethan was 25, elbow deep in expanding the shop, when his phone buzzed with a number he didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was raspy, unsure. "Hey, kid, it's your dad. Mind if we talk?" Ethan froze. Franklin Morgan? The name alone was enough to raise ghosts. He'd only seen photos of the man, grainy shots buried in the back of a photo album. The man had vanished when Ethan was still learning to talk. His mother never gave details, just murmurs about legal trouble and a hard life. Some said prison. Most just stopped asking. Now, out of nowhere, the man was alive and dialing his number. Ethan didn't know whether to hang up or hurl accusations, but what came out instead was, "Meet me at the diner tomorrow." When he told Lena, her reaction was instant suspicion. "Your father? After all this time? Are you sure it's really him?" Ethan nodded. He knew stuff no one else would. My dog's name, where we lived. It was him. She placed a cautious hand on his. "You don't owe him anything, Ethan." "I know, but maybe I owe myself something." The next morning, Ethan sat stiffly in a vinyl booth at a rundown diner off the highway. The air smelled like stale coffee and fryer oil. A few minutes later, a man who looked older than his years shuffled in, weathered leather jacket, lines etched deep into his face, gray streaks in unkempt hair. He spotted Ethan and raised a tentative hand before sliding into the seat across from him. "You look like me at that age," he said. "Taller, though." Ethan's mouth tightened. "That's all you've got?" Franklin sighed. "I'm sorry. I should have been around. But I made mistakes. Got in deep with the wrong people, and I ran." "You left me," Ethan said, his voice sharp. "You left Mom. She died 8 years ago. She never heard from you again." Pain flickered in Franklin's expression. "I know, and I'll never be able to make that right. But I want a chance, if you'll give it to me." Ethan narrowed his eyes. "You broke and looking for money?" Franklin shook his head. "No. I heard you were doing well. Married, successful. I just thought maybe I could be a part of it." There was something in his voice that felt sincere, but sincerity was cheap. Ethan didn't know whether he was hearing regret, guilt, or something more self-serving. "I've got a wife. I run a garage. That's my life. If you're trying to sneak in and stir things up, it won't work." Franklin swallowed hard. "I get it. I'll prove myself." Ethan didn't promise anything, but when Franklin asked to see the garage, he agreed. At the shop, Ethan kept it brief. Introduced him vaguely as someone I know. Let him glance around, marvel at the lifts and clean floors, not at the wall of glowing customer reviews. Franklin's eyes lit up with something that looked like pride. Over the next few weeks, Franklin returned, always careful, always courteous. He didn't push, didn't ask for anything. Eventually, Ethan let him come to the house. Lena's hospitality was ice-thin. She poured coffee, asked vague questions, and smiled with tight lips. She didn't trust Franklin, and Ethan could feel her unease in the way she sat too straight and kept her arms folded when he spoke. Franklin, though, played the role of the earnest father. He helped Ethan repair the garden fence, He showed Lena how to fix a leaky faucet. He even started referring to them as my kids when they went out to eat, which made Lena bristle behind her glass of wine. Still, Ethan wanted to believe it could work. He kept reminding himself that reconnection was messy. Maybe this discomfort was just part of healing. But even as he tried to ignore it, he couldn't help noticing a strange look in Franklin's eyes now and then. A flicker of something else. When his past came up, his gaze always shifted. When no one was watching, his jaw would tighten. Something was off, but Ethan pushed the feeling aside. Lena, on the other hand, didn't hide her doubt. She said all the right things, how good it was that Ethan was opening up, how maybe it would bring him peace. But he could tell she didn't mean it. She avoided Franklin when she could, and when she couldn't, she was clipped and curt. She never accused him of anything directly. She just watched. Quiet. Cold. Calculating. By the time they hit 6 years of marriage, Morgan Auto Repair had blossomed into a mini empire. 2 busy locations. A dependable team. Even a few used cars on the lot. Ethan was proud. He worked like hell to build something real, something lasting. To show appreciation, he bought Lena gifts, expensive ones. Jewelry, gadgets, a sleek espresso machine she never used. She accepted them with obligatory thank yous, never warmth. He knew they didn't fix anything, but they were the best tokens he had left. Meanwhile, Lena was starting to feel like a ghost in her own life. Most mornings she woke up to an empty bed, the sheets cold where Ethan had slept. He always left before dawn. Her days were filled with mindless chores, coffee dates with friends she barely listened to, and the aching awareness that her husband no longer saw her. By the time Ethan got home, usually close to 9, he was spent. They shared a few exhausted words, maybe a half-hearted meal, and then drifted into silence again. She wasn't just lonely anymore. She was invisible. Lena was starved for affection, for touch, for something real. She felt the void every time she reached for Ethan and found nothing but air. She'd suggested dinner dates, weekend getaways, even simple things like volunteering together, anything that might bring them back to the version of themselves that once laughed through midnight drives and danced in grocery store aisles. Ethan always nodded, always said sounds nice, but the follow-through was a different story. To him, love meant keeping the lights on and the fridge full. Everything else was optional. He didn't see it, how much more she needed. Not more money or gifts or furniture upgrades. Just him. And when she brought it up, she tried to do it gently, her voice measured, her tone calm. Ethan, you barely have time for us anymore. She'd murmur over another dinner growing cold on the table. He'd exhale, rubbing his temples. Babe, the shops don't run themselves. I'm doing this for us. And with that, the conversation would dissolve. Lena wouldn't press. She didn't want to come across as demanding. But the weight in her chest? That just grew heavier. Around that time, Franklin started showing up more often. He was in his early 50s now, still lean, but with that restless energy coiled in his limbs, like someone who never fully learned how to sit still. One crisp afternoon, he stopped by while Ethan was at the shop. Lena answered the door wearing an oversized sweater and sweatpants, her hair thrown up in a lazy bun. Hey there, sweetheart, Franklin greeted, casual as anything. Ethan said I could swing by and grab the hedge trimmer from the shed. Said you two weren't using it. Lena hesitated for half a second. Oh, yeah, I think it's out back. Let me unlock it. They walked together into the backyard. Autumn sunlight streamed between the branches of the tall oaks, warm and golden. As she fiddled with the padlock, Franklin leaned against the fence, quiet for a moment before asking, You doing okay? She pushed a strand of hair off her forehead, not quite looking at him. I'm fine. Just home too much, I guess. He nodded slowly. Yeah, you look a little off, if you don't mind me saying. She let out a breathy laugh, tugging the shed door open. Being married to a workaholic isn't all it's cracked up to be. Franklin studied her more carefully now. Ethan is a good guy, but he's got tunnel vision, always has. She glanced at him, a smirk tugging at her mouth. You can say that again. She handed him the hedge trimmer, their fingers almost brushing. His eyes lingered, not lecherously, but curiously on her face, her hair, the slope of her shoulder. And in that moment, she saw something in his expression, not just recognition, but reflection. Loneliness mirroring loneliness. It lasted all of a second. Thanks, he said quietly, hoisting the tool over his shoulder. Tell Ethan I said hey. I will, she replied, stepping back as he turned the corner. But as she closed the shed, a strange feeling settled in her gut, like the ground had shifted, just slightly. She scolded herself. He was her father-in-law. Complicated past or not, this was not a line you crossed. Still, That one conversation had felt more emotionally honest than anything she'd shared with Ethan in weeks. It started innocently enough after that. A loose floorboard in the hallway needed fixing. Ethan was too swamped to deal with it. Franklin, who'd done construction work in his younger years, offered to help. He showed up on a gray, rainy afternoon with a battered toolbox and a faint tune whistling from his lips. Lena made them coffee, grateful, maybe too grateful for the company. They worked side by side, mostly in silence. Franklin knelt on the floor, measuring and cutting. Lena held the flashlight, occasionally brushing sawdust from her pants. The scent of damp wood mixed with fresh coffee. The rain tapped rhythmically on the roof. It was quiet, intimate. Noticing her rubbing her arms, Franklin glanced up. "You cold?" She shrugged. "A little." Without missing a beat, he slid off his jacket and held it out to her. It smelled faintly of engine grease and cheap aftershave, similar to Ethan, but rougher, older, more worn in. She hesitated before slipping it over her shoulders. "Thanks," she murmured. He looked at her, just for a beat too long. "You're welcome." They went back to work, but the air between them had changed. Later, once the job was finished, they moved to the living room with their mugs. It should have ended there. But instead, the conversation shifted. He asked her questions no one else seemed to care about anymore. What she liked to do, what she used to dream of. And somehow, the words just poured out of her. "Ever regret not working?" he asked. She stared into her cup. "Sometimes. I used to like being a receptionist, believe it or not. But Ethan said I didn't need to work, and at the time it sounded perfect. Now, I just feel stuck." Franklin's voice lowered. "It's easy to feel invisible when no one asks how you're doing." She nodded. "Feels like I'm living in the background." Then his hand moved, hesitantly, slowly, and settled on hers. It was a small gesture, barely a touch. But it sent a shock through her body. "You deserve more than this," he said gently. Her breath hitched. Guilt surged, hot and nauseating. She should have pulled away. Should have stood, left the room, laughed it off. But she didn't. She sat there, frozen in place, hand under his, and for one aching heartbeat she let it be real. He saw her. Not as a wife or a burden, but as a woman. They pulled apart as quickly as it happened. Franklin stood abruptly, muttered something about his tools, and she avoided his eyes. Neither said what they were both thinking. But something had shifted. They knew it, felt it, and it didn't stop there. Their conversations became more frequent. Their interactions more layered. One sweltering afternoon, she brought him iced tea on the porch. The sun was merciless, the air heavy. They sat in silence for a while before she spoke. "I used to want to open a bakery," she said. "Or maybe go back to school, get a teaching certificate." Franklin looked at her like no one had in years, like she mattered. "Why not now?" She gave a bitter laugh. "Ethan doesn't think it's practical." Franklin didn't say much, but his face said enough. She kept talking. He did too. He told her about the years in prison, the bad choices, the shame. They connected not just over shared regret, but a mutual sense of missed chances and wasted time. In him, she saw understanding. In her, he found something dangerously close to redemption. By the time Lena and Franklin acknowledged how far they'd gone, the line they'd crossed was already behind them. The first kiss happened quietly, almost by accident, in the kitchen. Ethan was away at the second shop, buried in payroll and vendor calls. Lena had just returned from the store, arms full of groceries and a storm of thoughts swirling in her head, when Franklin knocked. He said he'd noticed a loose shutter and thought he'd drop by to tighten it up. She let him in. For a while, they danced around small talk. She unloaded bags while he leaned against the counter, watching her in that too familiar way. The air was thick with something unspoken, humming with a charge that neither dared name. Then it snapped. Their eyes locked. Her heart pounded like a drum. She didn't know who moved first. Maybe she leaned in. Maybe he did. But suddenly they were inches apart. Their lips met, hesitant and breathless, then deepened with all the longing they'd tried to deny. When the paper bag at her feet tipped over, apples rolled across the tile floor like startled witnesses. They pulled away, gasping, stunned by the rush of adrenaline and guilt. "Lena," Franklin whispered, voice low and shaky. "God, I'm sorry." She covered her mouth with trembling fingers. "We can't. This is wrong. This is insane." "I know," he said. "I should go." And he did. But a few days later, he came back. He had another excuse, a faulty outlet in the garage, or a toolbox he'd left behind. Neither of them spoke about what had happened, but neither of them stopped it either. Remorse battled need. Every thought told them to quit. Every emotion pulled them closer. They carved out moments in the margins of Ethan's schedule. Weekday afternoons, Saturday mornings when he was out on business or attending trade events. Lena told him she was visiting a cousin. Franklin said he was helping an old friend. Behind Ethan's back, a second life was taking shape, secret and silent. Then came the pregnancy. It hit her on a gray morning when her period didn't come. She took the test in the upstairs bathroom and stared at the result until the pink line blurred. A flicker of joy rose up, then immediately turned to dread. She and Ethan still had intimacy now and then, but his exhaustion had made it increasingly rare. With Franklin, the connection had been consistent, frequent. She told Ethan that evening, stopping him mid-conversation with a vendor on the phone. "We're pregnant," she said, barely above a whisper. He blinked, stunned. Then a slow smile broke across his face, and he dropped the phone mid-call to scoop her into a hug. "Lena, this is incredible," he said, eyes glassy. "You've just made me the happiest man alive." She smiled for him, nodded, clung to his joy. But her chest ached with guilt so sharp it felt like splinters. That night, she cried in the bathroom until her throat hurt. 2 days later, she told Franklin. He stood in the living room, fingers pressed to his forehead like he was trying to block out reality. "We'll figure it out," he said quietly. "Figure out what?" she snapped. "I'm married to your son. If this child is yours, what do we even do? We don't know anything yet. We'll wait until the baby's born. A test can be done. Until then, we wait." So they waited. Ethan threw himself into preparations. He bought furniture, painted a nursery, downloaded parenting apps. He rubbed her feet, made her tea, told her how proud he was. Lena let him. She didn't have the courage to disrupt the illusion. She told herself the baby might be his. She prayed for it. Caleb arrived on a crisp October evening, after hours of labor. Ethan stayed by her side the entire time, murmuring encouragement, holding her hand as she screamed. When the baby finally cried, so did he, unapologetically. She watched him hold her son, and felt something crack inside her. Then she saw Franklin in the hallway. He'd come, offering support as Ethan's father. But the way he looked at Caleb wasn't grandfatherly. It was too intense, too conflicted. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Ethan, for his part, stepped into fatherhood with enthusiasm and reverence. He woke for every cry, changed every diaper he could, sang lullabies in a clumsy voice that still made Lena smile. He loved Caleb with everything he had. Franklin began dropping by more often. "Just visiting my grandson," he'd say with a grin. No one questioned it. Family, after all. But Lena saw the way he watched Caleb. Saw the glisten in his eyes when Caleb cooed or reached out. Saw how he studied the baby's face like it held answers to questions no one dared ask. And sometimes Caleb looked back at him with wide brown eyes, and Lena's heart seized. She barely slept. Every quiet moment threatened to pull her under. She snapped at Ethan over spilled coffee, misplaced car keys, loud chewing. He wrote it off as postpartum fatigue. He never once imagined the real cause. December came, and with it a modest party at their home. Friends, employees, and neighbors gathered to celebrate the continued success of Morgan Auto. There was music, laughter, potluck casseroles, and a decorated tree. Franklin arrived, jovial and loud. Caleb in his arms as he swayed gently to Christmas tunes. Lena watched from across the room, her nerves fraying more with each second. Ethan told stories, laughed easily, and accepted congratulations with that tired but proud smile. He looked like a man who had it all. And Lena wanted to scream. Later, after the guests had left and Ethan stepped outside to help a friend jumpstart a dead battery, Franklin stayed behind. Lena was rinsing dishes when he came into the kitchen. He placed a plate next to her, voice low. "You've got to calm down." She didn't turn around. "It's hard," she whispered. "Every time you hold him, I wonder, what if Ethan notices something? A look, a habit, a face that's not his." Franklin leaned against the counter, his jaw tight. "I think about it too," he admitted. "Every single time." Franklin leaned back against the kitchen counter, arms crossed, voice low and careful. "Babies change so much, especially early on. You can't really tell who they resemble until they're older." Lena rubbed her forehead, her skin cold and damp. "It just feels so wrong," she whispered. Without asking, Franklin stepped forward and placed a hand on her shoulder. The touch ignited her nerves, warmth tangled with nausea, comfort tangled with shame. "We don't need to do anything drastic," he said. "We'll handle it later." Quietly. A private test, maybe. There's no reason to destroy everything right now. Tears welled at the corners of her eyes. I'm falling apart, Franklin. Every day. He gave a small, pained nod, the regret on his face no longer surprising. It was becoming part of him, part of this. I know, he said gently. Let's just keep it quiet a little longer. It's the only way. The sound of a door closing snapped them out of their moment. They sprang apart just as Ethan stepped in from outside, shutting the front door behind him. He glanced at them, oblivious. Thanks for helping clean up, Dad, he said, grabbing a stray cup off the table. Of course, Franklin replied with a too easy smile. Anything for family. Lena turned toward the sink, trembling, heart pounding. She stared down at the water, the soap bubbles drifting across the metal faucet, her warped reflection swimming back at her. It felt like one wrong move would collapse the entire illusion she'd spent years protecting. And soon, others started to notice. Lena's mother, Joanne Whitaker, a no-nonsense woman with hawk-like instincts, had always been good at sniffing out discomfort others tried to hide. During a holiday gathering, she caught Lena's eye when Franklin lingered too close to Caleb for too long. Joanne said nothing then, but her expression was unreadable. Later that night, when they were alone in the kitchen, Joanne whispered, "Are you sure everything's all right with Ethan's father?" Lena stiffened. "Yes, he's just trying to be more involved." Joanne's voice dropped. "Involved? He acts like more than a doting grandfather. There's something off about him. I don't like it." A wave of nausea hit Lena. "Mom, you're overthinking things." But Joanne didn't flinch. Her gaze sharpened. "I know men like him. Be careful, Lena." Lena forced a smile and changed the subject, but her mother's words settled in her chest like a splinter. She hated how easily Joanne could see through her. Meanwhile, Ethan continued pouring his energy into making life beautiful: new furniture, a luxury SUV, weekend getaways, jewelry she never asked for. He even bought Franklin a set of power tools, saying it was just a thank you for helping around the house. Lena played her part, smiled on cue, but inside she was fraying. She lived suspended between two lives. One, a comfortable existence with a devoted husband who never stopped trying but never really understood her. The other, a secret built on shame, anchored by Franklin's dangerous sense of emotional possession. And at the heart of it all was Caleb, innocent, unaware, loving his grandfather, without knowing that man might actually be his father. Then came the shift. 20 years passed in a blur of expansion, sacrifice, and aging. Ethan and Lena were both 45. Morgan Otto had grown beyond their dreams, and for the first time, Ethan allowed himself to step back. He delegated, took weekends off, started coming home for dinner. At first, Lena didn't know what to do with his presence. The man who had once spent his nights at the shop now sat beside her on the couch, helping Caleb with college applications, asking how her day had been. They went to the movies together again, shopped for new kitchen tiles, talked about trips they'd never taken. And slowly, something shifted inside her. She realized she still loved him. And that was when she knew, truly knew, that her relationship with Franklin had been a terrible mistake. It hadn't been love. It had been loneliness, weakness, and the illusion of being seen. The day she ended it, Lena met Franklin in a public park. He was waiting on an old bench near the fountain, his posture tense, his eyes clouded with suspicion. "You haven't written," he said flatly. "What's going on?" She took a deep breath, fingers tightening around the edge of her coat. "Franklin, this has to stop. All of it. I can't do this anymore." He stared at her, stunned, and then his expression twisted into something dark. "What are you talking about? Ethan is here now. He's trying. We're rebuilding. We're a family again." Franklin laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "A family? You're living a lie, Lena. He doesn't even know the truth." "Exactly," she snapped, though her voice shook. "He doesn't. And I can't keep living like this, carrying it around. I'm not yours, Franklin. I never was. You were an escape. That's all." His fists clenched at his sides. He stood slowly, breath coming heavy. For a few long seconds, he just stared at her, silent, unreadable. Then, finally, he nodded. "Fine," he said, his voice hoarse. "If that's what you want." And he walked away. No threats. No final word. He disappeared into the crowd like smoke, and never looked back. Lena sat on the bench after he left, heart racing, trying to believe it was really over. In the months that followed, life bloomed in strange, delicate ways. Ethan softened, laughed more, asked about things he used to overlook. He touched her more often, not out of obligation, but because he wanted to. Caleb, now in college, was thriving, curious, clever, full of ambition. He rarely mentioned his grandfather, and when he did, it was always in passing. "I wonder how Grandpa Rob is doing," he'd say, casually, before moving on. But Lena knew. Franklin's silence wasn't peace, it was pressure. It was the eerie quiet before a storm. He didn't call. He didn't show up. No messages, no inquiries through friends. And that terrified her more than if he had. Because it meant he was waiting. As the weeks passed, life gradually began to settle back into a rhythm for Lena and Ethan. Their days were filled with small joys, shared breakfasts, weekend walks, and quiet evenings watching old movies. The house felt calmer, warmer, almost like the life they'd once imagined. The heavy weight of the past seemed to lift, leaving only the soft glow of a family slowly repairing itself. But deep down, Lena couldn't shake the unease that lingered beneath the surface of every smile. Though Franklin had vanished, her instincts screamed that it wasn't over. The threat of him, of what he knew, what he might still do, hovered over her like a storm cloud waiting to break. She felt it in her bones, even during the stillest nights. It happened on one of those quiet nights. The world outside was silent, the sky starless and close. Ethan was half asleep in his recliner, soft snores rising from his chest. Lena sat beside him, flipping through a magazine, when a sudden blast of orange light lit up the living room window. Ethan jolted upright. "What the hell?" Lena rushed to the glass. Flames leapt into the air from their driveway, dancing and snarling like some unleashed beast. "Oh God, Ethan," she gasped. "Is that your truck?" He stumbled toward the door, eyes wide. "Call 911, he barked, yanking it open. The heat hit like a wall, thick and punishing. The roar of the fire drowned out everything else. His truck, his pride, the vehicle he'd worked overtime to afford, was engulfed, the metal melting under the blaze. Neighbors spilled out onto their porches, phones in hand, faces pale with shock. Within minutes, sirens pierced the night, red and blue lights flashing through the dark. Firefighters leapt into action, unfurling hoses, shouting over the noise. Water arced over the flames as Lena stood barefoot in her robe, heart pounding like a drum in her chest. The smell of smoke clawed at her throat. Even after the flames died, the truck remained, a blackened husk surrounded by puddles and ash. A police cruiser pulled up behind the fire engines, and a tall, square-jawed officer approached them with a notepad in hand. "Mr. Morgan?" he asked, glancing down at his notes. "I'm Officer Ramirez. Mind if I ask you a few questions?" Ethan nodded, eyes still locked on what remained of his vehicle. "Have you noticed anyone suspicious around here lately? Any threats? Disputes with anyone?" Ethan opened his mouth but hesitated. He ran an honest business, paid his bills, was well-liked. He shook his head slowly, at a loss. But beside him, Lena's stomach twisted. Her hand found Ethan's arm, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Officer," she said, we might know who did this." Ethan turned to her sharply. "Lena." She swallowed. "Your father. Franklin Morgan." Officer Ramirez's pen paused. "Franklin Morgan? You think he might be involved?" Lena nodded, her voice steadier now. "We haven't seen him in months. But there were issues. He left under complicated circumstances." The officer's eyes narrowed. "Any reason he'd target your husband?" Lena hesitated. "Too many reasons. Just personal ones," she said. "We'll look into it," Officer Ramirez promised. "But you both need to consider staying somewhere safe, just in case." The next morning, they barely moved from the living room. Ethan paced endlessly while Lena sat rigid on the edge of the couch, her phone clutched like a lifeline. "He's not getting away with this," Ethan muttered, fist clenched. Suddenly, Lena's phone buzzed. She looked down, unknown number. Her blood ran cold. She answered with a shaking hand. "Hello." "Hello." A amused chuckle drifted through the speaker. "Lena, I assume you got my message last night." She closed her eyes. "Franklin." His voice was smooth, too calm. "That was just a little warning. You don't come back to me, things'll get worse." "You're sick," she spat. "Am I? Or am I just a man who knows what he wants?" His voice dropped to a growl. "We had something real. Ethan can't give you what I can. I'm hanging up. You can try blocking me, sweetheart," he said with a chuckle, "but you can't hide forever." She ended the call and blocked the number with trembling fingers. Ethan was watching her closely. "Lena," he asked. "Who was it?" She forced the words out. "It was him. Your father. He threatened me." Ethan's face darkened, his jaw set. "I'm calling the police. He's not going to threaten my wife." She nodded, too shaken to argue. Inwardly, she cursed herself for ever letting Franklin get close, for not ending it sooner. Days passed. No more calls came. Police opened an investigation, But Franklin had vanished. No sightings, no activity, no leads. He'd melted into the shadows like smoke. Neighbors expressed sympathy. Friends offered spare rooms. Ethan replaced the truck with a modest sedan, refusing to spend more until things were safe. But Lena couldn't relax. Every knock at the door made her flinch. Every creak in the night made her sit bolt upright in bed. She peeked through windows, checked locks twice, sometimes 3 times. And then, unexpectedly, Caleb came home from college. He arrived in the early afternoon, duffel bag slung over his shoulder, smile wide. Surprise! Lena gasped. Ethan's face broke into the first real smile she'd seen in weeks. Kiddo. He rushed forward and pulled his son into a tight hug. For a moment, everything else, Franklin, the fire, the fear, fell away. Lena watched them from the kitchen doorway, hand over her heart, eyes wet. Maybe, just maybe, they still had a chance to feel safe again. Lena stepped into the room, eyes wet with emotion. "We've missed you," she said, pulling Caleb into a tight hug. That night over dinner, Caleb filled the house with stories about campus life, his job shelving books at the university library, the quirky drummer in his new band, a professor who only wore Hawaiian shirts. For a few precious hours, the house glowed with laughter and warmth, as if the chaos of the past had never touched them. For once, it felt like a family again. No one mentioned Franklin. A few evenings later, just as autumn leaves began to blanket the front lawn, Ethan got a call. The voice on the other end was familiar, strained. "Ethan, it's your mother. She's in the hospital. Stage 4. It's cancer." Ethan gripped the phone harder than necessary. He hadn't spoken to his mother in months. The last time he'd seen her, she'd been fragile but cheerful, avoiding any mention of Franklin with determined silence. She'd never forgiven him for vanishing the way he did. "They're saying she doesn't have much time left," the friend continued, voice cracking. "I'm coming," Ethan replied, already reaching for an overnight bag. As he packed, Lena stood in the doorway, worry etched into every line of her face. "I'll call you as soon as I get there," Ethan said, pressing a kiss to her forehead. She took his hand, clinging to it. "Be careful. If your father finds out you're in town." Ethan nodded. "We're going for Mom. That's all that matters." The drive to Silverton stretched on like a road from a memory. When he arrived at the hospital, he found his mother asleep, and 4 in her arm and oxygen tubes in her nose. She stirred at the sound of his voice. "Ethan," she rasped, eyes fluttering open. "You came." He leaned down and kissed her forehead. "Of course. I should have come sooner." "You're here now," she whispered. "That's enough." They spoke quietly for a while, their words circling around old stories and distant memories. But eventually, she cut through the pleasantries with surprising clarity. "Is it your father?" she asked. "Did he do something again?" Ethan hesitated. The image of the burning truck flashed through his mind. "He's made threats," he admitted. Her face darkened, lips trembling. "I always feared that. He never knew how to love without breaking things." Ethan looked away, guilt gnawing at him. Even after all the damage, a part of him had hoped, foolishly, that Franklin might still change. "I won't let him hurt us," Ethan said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. She nodded faintly. "Just be careful." Ethan dozed in a stiff hospital chair, the sound of machines humming like distant thunder. At dawn, his phone rang. It was Caleb. "Dad," his voice cracked, panicked. "I just got back to the house. The front door's been kicked in. There's blood. And Mom's gone." Ethan sat up, heart slamming into his ribs. "What do you mean she's gone?" "She's not here. The place is wrecked. Drawers open, furniture overturned. Dad, there's blood on the floor." "Don't go inside," Ethan ordered. "Don't touch anything. I'm on my way." His mother stirred in her bed. "What's wrong?" she croaked. "Something happened to Lena," he said, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "I'll be back." She closed her eyes, voice barely audible. "Franklin." Ethan didn't wait. He ran, feet pounding hospital hallways, mind reeling with one desperate thought. Please let Lena be alive. Police lights splashed across the driveway when he pulled in. Officers lined the front lawn. Ethan pushed past the yellow tape, Caleb right behind him. The living room was chaos. Furniture overturned. Picture frames shattered. The TV smashed in the corner. Blood stained the carpet in uneven streaks. "Lena," Ethan shouted, voice hoarse. A detective approached, stepping carefully around broken glass. "Mr. Morgan?" "I'm Detective Hale." Ethan nodded tightly. "We're conducting a full search," Hale said. "But your wife isn't here." Caleb's voice trembled. "There's blood. Where is she?" We've sent samples to the lab, the detective replied. We'll know soon whether it's hers or someone else's. Ethan dropped to his knees, fists clenched. He took her, he growled. My father took her. Hale scribbled in his notepad. We'll issue a statewide alert for Franklin Morgan immediately. Caleb looked around, horror in his eyes. What do we do now? Ethan stood slowly, his voice razor sharp. We don't stop. Not until we bring her home. 2 days of torment followed. No clues. No sightings. The detectives turned up nothing. No fingerprints. No solid DNA. No lead beyond the blood and chaos. Ethan didn't sleep. Neither did Caleb. They knocked on doors, called old contacts, and drove from one corner of the city to the other with a photo of Lena in hand. Nothing. Then, at 2:03 a.m. on the third night, Ethan's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. If you want her back, come to this location. Beneath it, a set of GPS coordinates. No name. No instructions. Just the taunt. Ethan stared at the screen, heart thundering. He shook Caleb awake. Get dressed. Caleb blinked. What's going on? We've got a lead. They drove through the dead of night, headlights barely slicing through the fog. The coordinates led them to the edge of town, where nature had begun reclaiming forgotten land. Rusted fences lined the road. Empty, decrepit buildings rose like tombstones. They pulled up to an old clapboard house with a buckling roof and broken porch steps. The front door hung crooked on its hinges, creaking in the wind. Moonlight bathed the yard in silver. Caleb swallowed hard. We should wait for the police. Ethan shook his head slowly, jaw clenched. No, not this time. There might not be time, Ethan whispered. They stepped inside the decrepit house, flashlights cutting narrow paths through the blackness. The air was thick with the stench of mold and rot. Floorboards groaned beneath their weight as they crept down the hallway, hearts pounding in their ears. And then they saw her. Lena. She was slumped in a rickety wooden chair, limbs bound tightly with rope, her face bruised, lips split, clothes torn. The room around her looked like a twisted parody of a living room, walls smeared with grime, broken furniture pushed aside, a shattered mirror reflecting only shadows. It was a chamber of cruelty. Mom! Caleb shouted, running forward. Ethan was at his side, shining the beam of his flashlight across Lena's pale, battered face. Her eyelids fluttered open. Ethan? Caleb, she rasped. Ethan dropped to his knees, fumbling with the ropes. Hang on, honey. We're here. We're getting you out. A voice growled from the dark. Not so fast. They spun around. Franklin Morgan stepped into the moonlight, gun raised in his fist. His eyes burned with a wild, manic light, and the shadows deepened the hollows of his gaunt face. Dad, Ethan said, his voice low and steady despite the surge of fear rising in his chest. Franklin sneered. Back away from her. Caleb lifted his hand slowly. Grandpa, please, just let her go. Franklin's face twisted. Grandpa, he spat. Don't call me that. I haven't been a grandfather to anyone. Lena struggled against the ropes, tears streaming down her cheeks. Franklin, this is insane. Let me go? Please. He stared at her, gaze flickering with something deranged, almost tender. You forget so quickly, Lena. What we had. I told you what would happen if you walked away. Ethan clenched his fists. The man he'd once hoped could change was gone. Only madness remained. You're not taking her anywhere, Ethan said. And if you think you'll get away with this. Franklin let out a bitter laugh. Get away with it? Son, don't act like you're innocent. You practically handed her to me. Always gone. Always buried in your garage. You ignored her. She was starving for affection. That's not true, Caleb said softly, his voice cracking. They love each other. Franklin turned toward him, gun twitching in his hand. Love? He echoed. Is that what you think this is? His face twisted, contorted with rage, jealousy, bitterness, and then he said it. You're my son, Caleb. Not his. The room fell silent. The air turned to glass. Caleb's mouth fell open. What? Ethan stood frozen. Lena choked back a sob. Franklin's voice rose. That's right. Lena and I, your mother and I, we had an affair. While Ethan was off building his empire, I was there, giving her what she needed. Lena's head dropped, tears spilling onto her lap. Franklin, stop, please. Stop what? Franklin shouted. Telling the truth? Isn't this what you all wanted? Honesty? Closure? Well, here it is. Ethan's world tilted. All the doubts, the old wounds, the awkward silences, they collapsed into a single horrifying realization. His father had taken everything. His trust, his peace, his family. You've ruined everything, Ethan hissed. My marriage, my son, my life. I gave her what you wouldn't. Franklin roared. Attention, understanding. And then Ethan snapped. He lunged. The collision knocked the pistol from Franklin's hand. It skittered across the floor. The two men crashed into a broken table, fists flying, snarling like animals. Years of betrayal exploded in every punch. Caleb dove for the gun, but it slid just out of reach. Ethan! Lena screamed, still bound, blood running from her lip. Franklin twisted, slamming a knee into Ethan's ribs. Ethan groaned but landed a brutal punch to Franklin's jaw, sending blood and spit flying. Dad! Caleb shouted, scrambling across the floor. Franklin reached the gun first. He twisted around and fired. The shot cracked like a thunderclap, the muzzle flash searing across the shadows. Lena screamed as the bullet tore into her shoulder, knocking her back in the chair. Blood splattered against the faded wall. No! Ethan bellowed, diving for Franklin. Caleb hurled himself forward, adrenaline surging. He kicked Franklin's arm with all his strength, sending the gun clattering again. Ethan grabbed Franklin, slamming him into the wall with a roar. Caleb scrambled to Lena's side, grabbing at the loosened rope from earlier. He spun back, tossed a length to Ethan, and together they forced Franklin to the floor, binding his wrists behind his back. Franklin thrashed violently, foam on his lips, fury burning in his eyes. You don't understand, he screamed. She was mine. Ethan didn't say a word. His face was rigid with fury, with heartbreak, with finality. Blood soaked Lena's shirt, and she slumped forward, gasping in pain. Mom, Caleb cried, cradling her gently. We've got you. You're okay. Just hang on. Sirens echoed in the distance, growing louder. Help was coming. But for Ethan, the damage was already done. His father had left scars that would never fade. He looked down at Franklin Morgan, writhing on the floor, eyes filled with hatred, and knew this chapter was over. But the healing? That was only beginning. You can't do this. Franklin roared, thrashing beneath Ethan's grip. She loves me, not you. Ethan pressed his forearm harder against Franklin's neck. Shut your mouth, he growled. You've done enough. Caleb fumbled with his phone, fingers trembling as he punched a 911. While he gave clipped, panicked answers to the dispatcher, Lena's soft whimpers filled the broken silence, each one a jagged reminder of the bullet lodged in her shoulder. Red and blue lights slashed through the darkness as police cruisers and ambulances arrived in a blur of tires and shouting. Paramedics rushed in, gently placing Lena onto a stretcher. Her body had gone limp, her eyes half-lidded and glassy. She lost consciousness as they carried her out the door. Ethan tried to follow her, but an officer stepped in front of him. Sir, we need your statement. Please stay here. Behind them, two officers dragged Franklin out in handcuffs. He fought them the whole way, spitting curses, eyes wild and unrepentant. You'll pay for this, he screamed at Ethan. You think this is over? You're a coward, Ethan. A goddamn coward. Ethan didn't answer. He only stared as the squad car pulled away, taillights glowing in the night until they disappeared completely. Caleb stepped beside him, hand resting lightly on his shoulder. Dad, we have to go. We have to be with her. Ethan nodded slowly, gaze locked on the bloodstains still wet on the floor. Everything he'd built, his family, his trust, his marriage, had been dismantled right here in this house of horrors. By his own father. Without another word, he followed Caleb to the ambulance. The final cost of everything had just come due. The hospital was a blur of white light and antiseptic air. Tom lost shape there. Minutes dragged. Hours vanished. Ethan sat hunched in a plastic chair outside Lena's room, elbows on his knees, fingers knotted in silent prayer, though he didn't know who he was praying to anymore. The rhythmic beep of the machines inside sounded like a slow funeral march. Caleb sat beside him, silent, his leg bouncing a restless staccato against the linoleum floor. Inside the room, Lena lay unmoving. A ventilator hissed at regular intervals, keeping her barely tethered to life. The bullet had done more damage than expected. It had shattered bone, ruptured blood vessels, and set off a cascade of complications that no one had predicted. Every time the door opened and a doctor stepped out, Ethan's stomach knotted. Every update chipped away a little more hope. On the third morning, the head surgeon, a tall man with silver hair and the weary eyes of someone who'd delivered too many death notices, approached them. His gown was splattered with red. "Mr. Morgan," he began, voice steady but somber. "We did everything we could." Ethan felt the words hit before they fully landed. A ragged sound escaped his throat. His knees buckled. He barely caught himself on the chair's edge. Caleb let out a sharp breath, fists curling at his sides. She fought hard. The doctor continued gently. But the internal bleeding was extensive. Her body went into shock. Her heart simply couldn't recover. Ethan shook his head, tears blurring his vision. "No. You said she was stable last night. You told us she was getting better. She was holding on," the doctor said softly. "But she couldn't hold on forever. She passed at 5:47 this morning." Caleb turned away, stumbling to the wall. He leaned against it, one hand splayed out like he needed the wall to keep him from falling. "No," he whispered. "No, she can't be gone." And then he broke. A guttural sob tore through him, loud and raw and jagged. He pounded the wall with clenched fists, his whole body shaking. "She lied to us," he cried out, the words nearly torn from him. "She lied to me." Ethan didn't move. He couldn't. "She was supposed to be my mother." Caleb screamed, voice cracking. "She was supposed to love us, to protect us. But she hid everything." Ethan stared down at the floor. His son's grief mirrored his own, but there were no words. No comfort. Just wreckage. Caleb laughed bitterly, almost choking on it. "She broke me the moment she started lying. And now she's dead, and I don't even know who she really was." Ethan had no reply. He'd spent his whole marriage thinking he knew the woman he loved. But that illusion had died along with her. A soft knock came from the door. A nurse stepped inside, her expression gentle, her voice calm. "Take your time," she said. "We'll be here when you're ready." Ethan nodded faintly, but he wasn't ready. He didn't think he ever would be. The funeral was held beneath a gray sky that couldn't decide if it wanted to cry or just hover there, silent and cold. Rain fell in a soft, persistent drizzle, soaking the grass around the freshly dug grave. The casket sat above the earth, a deep mahogany box adorned with lilies that now drooped in the damp air. Ethan stood motionless, hands in his coat pockets, his face unreadable. Caleb stood next to him, shoulders hunched, coat damp, grief etched into his every movement. Around them, neighbors and distant relatives stood in somber silence. A pastor spoke about healing and eternity, but his words rang hollow in the open air. Nothing could make sense of this. Ethan barely listened. His mind was a storm, images flashing without order. Lena's laughter, her betrayal, her blood. It all blurred. When the pastor stepped aside, Caleb approached the casket, a single white rose clutched in his trembling hand. He stood there for a moment, saying nothing. No whispered goodbye. No eulogy. Just silence. He dropped the rose onto the lid and turned away. Some wounds went too deep for words. Caleb's lips pressed into a thin, trembling line as his fists clenched at his sides. Then, without warning, he kicked at the ground, sending a spray of wet soil across the gravesite. "I hate you for this," he choked out, his voice fractured. "I hate you for making me love you, and then destroying everything." Ethan stood silently in the rain, the words slicing through him. He watched as his son, his heartbroken, betrayed son, crumbled under the weight of it all. Ethan wanted to speak, to say something that might help, but there was nothing left that could. Caleb wasn't looking for comfort. He was searching for an answer, a reason, something Ethan himself couldn't give. Instead, Ethan moved forward, letting the drizzle soak his shoulders, watching the droplets streak down the polished mahogany of the casket. Slowly, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his wedding ring. The gold band, once a symbol of love and promise, glinted faintly in the gray light before slipping from his fingers. It landed on the coffin with a soft, final clink. Caleb stared, eyes filled with questions he didn't voice. Ethan turned away without a word, walking slowly as the first shovelful of dirt fell onto the lid. The past was being buried, literally and figuratively. There was nothing left to say. Franklin Morgan's trial moved quickly but struck like a hammer. The courtroom became a crucible where every lie, betrayal, and violent act was laid bare. Evidence piled high. Statements from Ethan, from Caleb, and even Lena's fragile testimony before surgery sealed Franklin's fate. He was convicted of kidnapping, arson, aggravated assault, and second-degree murder. At sentencing, Ethan sat beside Caleb in the gallery. His hands were fists in his lap, his face a statue of restrained fury. Caleb sat rigid, barely breathing, the enormity of everything still weighing on his young shoulders. And across the courtroom, Franklin stood in shackles, his orange jumpsuit hanging loose over his gaunt frame. He looked like a ghost, pale, thin, but still venomous. The judge read the sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole. Franklin didn't flinch. He simply sneered, turning his hollow eyes toward the only two people left in the world who still bore his name. But as the guards led him away, he locked eyes with Caleb. And for a single heartbeat, something shifted. A flicker of sorrow, or was it regret, surfaced in his expression before the cold mask returned. Then he was gone, swallowed by steel doors and the silence of a prison corridor. In the weeks after the trial, Ethan and Caleb sought the truth. They went to 2 different DNA labs, needing answers they could trust, no doubt, no question marks. The results came back the same. Caleb was not Ethan's biological son. The final cut. Ethan sat in their quiet living room, staring at the results while the echo of Lena's laughter haunted the corners of the house. Caleb sat across from him, hunched, voice unsteady. "So I really am he whispered, unable to finish. Ethan's throat tightened. Tears welled in his eyes, but he held them back. "It doesn't change anything," he said, his voice hoarse. "You're still my son. I raised you. I taught you how to ride a bike. I cheered at your football games. I held you when you cried. Biology doesn't erase any of that." Caleb broke then, his body shaking as sobs ripped from him. He buried his face in his hands, and Ethan crossed the room without hesitation, wrapping his arms around him. "None of this is your fault," Ethan said firmly. "Do you hear me? You didn't choose this. And you're not alone." They sat that way for a long time, grief and love tangled between them. A month later, the house was quiet again. Caleb had returned to college, trying to salvage the remnants of a lost semester. Ethan moved through the home like a ghost, familiar rooms now hollowed by absence. The coffee on the counter had gone cold. He hadn't touched it. Then the phone buzzed. Just once. He answered without checking the number, expecting a robocall or a utility company. "Mr. Morgan," came a voice he recognized. "Officer Ramirez, from the prison." Ethan straightened in his chair. "Yes. I'm calling about your father," Ramirez said after a pause. "There was an incident in the yard today. A fight broke out. Franklin Morgan was attacked by several inmates." Ethan's heart thudded once, sharply. "Is he?" "He was stabbed multiple times. Paramedics tried to intervene, but—" "I'm sorry. He died about an hour ago." Ethan didn't speak. The silence on the line stretched, but he didn't fill it. Ramirez continued, "We're still investigating. If anything comes up, we'll be in touch." "I understand," Ethan replied quietly and ended the call. He sat for a long moment, staring at nothing. Then, slowly, a faint smile pulled at the corners of his mouth. It was done. The man who had inflicted so much pain, who had haunted every chapter of Ethan's adult life, was gone. No parole. No lingering threats. Just gone. And in that emptiness, Ethan felt something shift. Not joy. Not peace. But a weight lifted. He stood from the table and walked into the kitchen. With one motion, he flicked off the light. Darkness folded around him. He stood there for a moment, thinking of Lena, of the woman she had been, of the lies she had carried, and the memories that would never completely leave him. The love they had once shared had been real, even if its foundation had crumbled beneath them. Now, finally, she was gone. And so was Franklin. The wounds would remain, but the war was over. Revenge hadn't brought peace, but it had brought something close enough. Closure. And for now, Ethan decided, that would have to be enough.